Welcome to lecture 3. So before coming to this part of the lecture, I hope that you have already gone through the video on dependency theory that I provided the link of on the Canvas page. If not, please pause this video and go to view that video before coming here because the video is really a good summary of what dependency and world system theory is. Remembering we were talking about modernization theory by Rostow in the last lecture, around late 1960s and 1970s, there is a response to the modernization theory, which comes from predominantly from Latin America, and it is called the dependency theory, which also evolves into a world system theory. Okay, so I want to first show you what exactly happens in the world from 1950s to 1970s to give you a kind of context where these different development theories come from. So, as I mentioned in the very first lecture, the concept of development is actually given birth in the context of Cold War, the United States was really committed in the 1950s to fight communism, and there were a lot of activities of the United States in Asia. For instance, its involvement in the Korean War and supporting regime change in Afghanistan and Iran, and support of the Suharto regime in Indonesia and Vietnam War. And in the 1950s, there was a friendly relationship between the US and Latin America. However, in 1959, after the Cuban revolutions, the United States started to intervene politically in many Latin American states, supporting different coup and also dictatorships. So the relationships between U.S. and Latin America started to deteriorate. And there was a commodity boom in Latin America in the 1970s that attracted a lot of US capital. So there are a lot of US foreign investments in Latin America in the 1970s. And there were strong feelings of imperialism. By the Latin American countries, especially on the political interventions by the United States. So in the 1970s, the UN actually asked for an action plan for a new international economic order. So the new international economic order were actually some proposals about changing the terms of trades and the global economic structure so that the developing or the peripheral countries can benefit from it. So countries around the world, especially developing or underdeveloped countries, recognize that there are some very unfair terms of trades and unfavorable power structure that cause them to be undeveloped or obstruct their development pathway. So they have pledged together for the global community to support a new international economic order. And this was unfortunately rejected by the powerful countries, so none of the proposals were ever implemented. And then there was a Declaration of Right to Development in 1986 following this, because countries feel like there is a need to exert their right to development in this global unequal power structure. So, the readings that I asked you to read is from these two gentlemen, Gudon Frank and also Wallerstein. So, Gudon Frank is one of the earlier people who talk about underdevelopment and dependency theory. He's a German Jew and a sociologist and economic historian, and he actually fled from Germany during World War II. And then he spent a significant amount of time in US and then in Latin America. So he was really familiar with the continent of Latin America. And Wallenstein was American born, bred, raised, and trained. And he passed away last year in August. So Wallenstein is the one who talks a lot about world system theory, and he had a book in the 1970s on the world system. But the one that I asked you to read is his publication in 2004, which has kind of updated versions to increase the relevance of the theory to today's world system. Okay, so what does dependency theory talks about? So you have viewed a video, so you understand the basic concept of dependency theory and where it comes from. So what I'm telling you here is specifically based on Good and Frank writing, but development theories are many. There are many people who follow this theory and write out different writings to express this thought. So the one that I'm sharing with you here is specifically by Gordon Frank in 1966. So he was one of the earlier thinkers on dependency theory. So he was trying to counter modernization theory at the time, and he was taking a historical and structural approach. So he was saying that the modernization theory kind of ignore the history of the world and also ignore the structure of the world. So he believed that by looking at the history of places and also by looking at the global power structure, we will see that it is not as simple as modernization. Not every country can easily just go to the 5 stages of economic growth as suggested by Rostow. And then Glutenfrag really says that underdevelopment is not really a result of isolations and archaic institution, but an active creation or results of interactions with developed region. So he was saying that basically because some regions are actively interacting with the so-called developed regions, they become underdeveloped through this relationship. So he defined this underdeveloped region as satellites and the developed region as metropoles. So satellites are dependent on metropoles for its functioning and for its economic activities. So it is a form of dependency. And he has offered several observations to support the possibility of this theory. Number one, he observed that there are many prosperous regions in Latin America that eventually declined because they didn't possess the self-generating capacity because they have been functioning as the satellites for some metropoles, maybe in Europe. So he gives some examples of some regions in Chile and Brazil. And also he talks about how some of the prosperous cities within Latin America itself were observed to decapitalize the surrounding areas. So the growth of a big city like Sao Paulo didn't actually benefit the surrounding area, but actually seems to deprive the surrounding area. And then he also offered the observation that some satellites achieve best development when ties to metropoles are the weakest. So for example, during world wars and depressions, and also places with geography and economic isolations. And satellites suffer when metropoles are strong. Also by observing the economic relation between metropoles and satellites through different periods, Good Frank observed that when the metropoles are really strong, for example, after they recover from the World War, the satellites further suffer by being structurally more underdeveloped. And most underdeveloped regions in the world actually were not isolated regions but had historical ties with metropoles. So these were some of the observations that Gutenberg offered to advance his argument that underdevelopment is a result of interactions with the metropoles, not a result of isolations and old institutions.